He paid £68,000 to erase her family's ruin, and in return, he got a bride who despised him. There was no courtship, no stolen glance across a crowded ballroom, only a signature at the bottom of a legal deed and a carriage ride into the wild, wind-scoured Cornish coast. This is the story of a marriage that began as a business arrangement and the 4 words that quietly rewrote everything. Stay until the end, because the wedding night twist is the part nobody expects. The wedding gown was exquisite, provided one didn't have to actually wear it. Isabel Hartley found it suffocating. The pale silver silk felt less like a dress and more like a cage, stiff against her ribs, the boning digging into her with every breath. She stood in the vestibule of St. Aldrich's, staring at the carved oak doors separating her from the altar, and she did not cry. Isabel was 23, an age society had already begun to whisper about, and she had long since buried any girlish notion of love. Love was a luxury. The Hartleys could not afford luxuries. Her father, Lord Edmund Hartley, was a man of expensive habits and catastrophic luck. The card rooms of London had swallowed his estate, his investments, and finally his daughter's future. Gabriel Ashworth, the Duke of Rothmere, had intervened, not out of kindness, but out of cold calculation. He needed a wife of respectable blood to silence the rumors surrounding his ailing mother, a wife who would not expect sonnets or affection. He purchased Isabel's hand by wiping her father's ledger clean. It was, in every sense, a transaction. The doors opened. A draught swept through the stone corridor, guttering the candles. Isabel walked the aisle toward a church that was mostly empty. Gabriel had wanted no spectacle, and her father was too ashamed to summon his peers to witness the sale of his own child. Gabriel stood waiting, broad-shouldered, dressed in unrelenting black, looking less like a storybook prince and more like a man who oversaw thousands of acres and hundreds of tenant lives. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair combed back with military precision. When his eyes met hers, they were the pale grey of a sky before snowfall, no warmth, but no cruelty either. It was the look of a man inspecting a property he was about to acquire. "Miss Hartley," he said, low and rough. "Your Grace," she answered. The vicar's words washed over her, meaningless. For richer, for poorer. She nearly laughed, the poorer half had already been fully hers. When Gabriel slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his hand was warm, his calluses catching against her knuckles. It was over in minutes. They signed the registry, the ink still wet, and stepped into the grey drizzle of a London afternoon. No wedding breakfast. No well-wishers. Only a black carriage waiting at the curb, its horses stamping on the slick cobblestones. Her father offered a weak, oily smile. "You'll want for nothing, Isabel. He's a good man. A wealthy one." "Goodbye, father," she said flatly, and let the footman hand her up into the carriage. Gabriel followed, the vehicle dipping under his weight. The door shut. The lock clicked, final, absolute. They rode in silence for hours, the city dissolving into hedgerows and grey coastal fog. Gabriel opened a leather portfolio and reviewed architectural drawings, pencil in hand, already returned to his work less than an hour into their marriage. Isabel felt a flash of irritation, followed swiftly by relief. If he ignored her, she could survive this. When dusk finally bled into the sky, the carriage turned down a private drive lined with wind-bent pines, and Rothmere Hall came into view, not a delicate Palladian villa, but a sprawling fortress of dark granite built to withstand the sea itself. "It's draughty," Gabriel said suddenly, the first words he'd spoken in hours. "The East Wing especially. I've had Mrs. Whitfield put you in the South Chambers. They catch what little sun the coast allows." "Thank you," Isabel managed. The carriage halted. Servants lined the entrance hall, silent and still, headed by an older woman with iron-grey hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Welcome to Rothmere, Your Grace," said the housekeeper, dropping into a crisp curtsy. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Gabriel said, shrugging off his coat. "Take the Duchess to her rooms, she's tired from the road. We'll dine at 8. He did not ask if she was tired. He stated it, an order for the household, then vanished down a dim corridor without another glance. The southern chambers were grand and still bitterly cold despite the fire snapping in the hearth. A young maid named Nora helped Isabel change into a simple gown of dark blue wool, pinning her hair while Isabel stared hollow-eyed at her own reflection. Dinner was an exercise in silence stretched across 70 feet of polished mahogany, 3 candelabras throwing long shadows up the vaulted ceiling. Isabel pushed roasted lamb around her plate, appetite gone, dread coiling tighter with every tick of the mantel clock. Her father's parting words echoed in her skull, "Give him an heir, Isabel. That's all he requires." But the reality of submitting to this silent, imposing stranger made her hands tremble beneath the table. She set down her fork. "The food isn't to your liking," Gabriel observed. "It's fine, Your Grace. I'm simply not hungry. You should eat. You're too thin." The audacity of it sparked something reckless in her chest, 2 years of rationing meals so the last of the servants could be paid. "I apologize if my appearance displeases you," she said, ice in her voice. "Perhaps you ought to have inspected the merchandise more carefully before completing the purchase." The room went utterly still. Gabriel sat back, studying her over the candlelight for a long moment. "I did not buy a broodmare, madam," he said quietly. "I married a wife. I merely observed that you look exhausted. You'll find I speak plainly. I expect the same of you." He rose, tossed his napkin onto the table. "I'll be in my study. I'll come to your rooms at 11. And he was gone, leaving the appointment hanging in the air like a verdict. By 10:30, Nora had brushed Isabel's hair into a dark curtain and dressed her in a thin white nightgown, then curtsied and slipped away, the latch clicking shut behind her. Isabel paced the cold floorboards, watching a pale moon break through the clouds over the desolate grounds. "It will be quick," she told herself. "Close your eyes. Let him take what he paid for." A heavy knock sounded. Her breath caught. "Come in," she rasped. The door opened, and Gabriel stepped through. No silk dressing gown, only his coat and cravat removed, his linen shirt open at the collar. He carried 2 crystal glasses and a decanter of brandy, setting them down near the hearth without a word. "You look like you're facing a firing squad, Isabel. Drink this." She crossed the room slowly, avoiding his eyes, and took the glass with a trembling hand. Their fingers brushed. His were startlingly warm. "I'm aware," he began, staring into the dying fire, "that this isn't the marriage you wanted. It's the marriage I have, Your Grace." "Gabriel," he corrected softly. "When we're alone, there will be no titles between us." He turned to look at her fully. "Your father's creditors weren't gentlemen, Isabel. They were preparing to take far more than his property. I stepped in because your family's name deserved better than that mud, and because I required a wife. A convenient arrangement for us both." "Yes," he agreed, stepping closer. Isabel retreated instinctively until her shoulders met the bedpost, the flinch involuntary. Gabriel stopped instantly, reading the white-knuckled grip on her glass, the braced posture, the raw dread in her eyes. Silence stretched, thick and unbearable. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for what she believed was inevitable. Instead, his hand settled on her shoulder. Not a grasp, but a weight, warm and unbearably gentle. His thumb moved, the faintest brush against her collarbone. He did not pull her toward the bed. He simply stood there, grounding her in the space between them, and then, barely above a whisper, "May I continue?" Isabel's eyes flew open. The cold, calculating Duke was gone, replaced by a man asking for permission he legally didn't need. He was waiting, for her, for a single word that could still end this before it began. She realized, with sudden clarity, that if she said no, he would remove his hand and walk out the door. The transaction would simply end. She looked into his winter-grey eyes, and something cold at the center of her cracked. "Yes," she whispered. "You may." The bed was empty when Isabel woke, the space beside her cool, the fire long dead, the cold biting through the massive stone room. She lay still, taking inventory, no pain, no lingering shame. It hadn't been some explosive fairy tale. She was too cynical to expect that, and he was too grounded to attempt it. Instead, it had been careful, deliberate, watchful. He had never once treated her as anyone but herself, pausing whenever she tensed, moving only when she exhaled. He hadn't said, "I love you." He had asked, "Are you all right?" To Isabel, that was worth infinitely more. Nora arrived with coal and hot water. "Good morning, Your Grace." The Duke's been out since 6, down at the tenant farms. Frost got into the winter wheat. Isabel sat up, pulling the quilts close. Her own father wouldn't have known a frost had struck unless a steward handed him an unpaid bill. On the vanity sat a folded note in sharp, economical handwriting: "The south rooms are still cold despite my orders. Fires are to be kept high. Do not hesitate to direct the staff. This house is yours to run." Gee! Not a love letter. An operating directive. And yet something tightened warmly in her chest at the words "yours to run." Within the hour, dressed in practical dark green wool, Isabel found Mrs. Whitfield in the morning room, wrestling with the butcher's accounts. 2 shillings a pound for salted beef, Isabel said, scanning the ledger. That's daylight robbery. Even in London in the depths of winter it doesn't top 1 and 6. Mr. Foss has supplied this house for 20 years, Your Grace. Then Mr. Foss has been robbing this house for 20 years. Isabel met the older woman's stare without blinking. Send word. Tell him the Duchess finds his prices insulting, and if he won't lower them to 1 and 4, we'll slaughter and salt our own cattle. A long silence, and then something like respect flickered in Mrs. Whitfield's eyes. Yes, Your Grace. Isabel had spent for years keeping her father's household barely afloat. She knew the price of mutton down to the farthing, and she would not tolerate being fleeced in someone else's name, even if that someone had purchased her outright. Gabriel arrived at midday reeking of horse and cold wind, mud caked to his boots. You changed the butcher's contract. I did. Overturn it if you like. Foss stormed into the estate office an hour ago, red-faced, insisting a London girl had no business dictating country prices. Isabel braced for reproach. And what did you tell him? That he was fortunate you hadn't audited the last decade of his receipts, and that if he ever spoke disrespectfully of my wife again, I'd cancel his lease. She stared at him, disarmed. He agreed to 1 and 3. You saved me £30 a year in 5 minutes. I know numbers, she said quietly. It was the only thing I was ever allowed to control. Gabriel studied the crack in her composure. You are not hiding here, he said. Not pity, a simple fact, laid at her feet. Weeks folded into a rhythm. Not romance in any storybook sense, no poetry, no moonlit walks, but a different intimacy grew, built from shared labor. Isabel took over half the estate office, cross-referencing grain shortages, saving Gabriel a week of travel, until one afternoon he simply slid the inkwell toward her without a word. They worked in companionable silence for hours, the scratch of quills becoming a shared heartbeat. She watched him ride out during a fever outbreak among the dairy farms, watched him personally fund new timber when a cottage roof collapsed. He was not a charming man. He was a profoundly good one. One December evening, wind rattling the window panes, Isabel rubbed at her aching temples over a coal ledger. Your eyes are strained, Gabriel said, not looking up. I'm fine, she lied. He rose, circled the desk, and rested his hands on her shoulders. She tensed, an old reflex, before his thumbs found the knots at the base of her neck and pressed them loose. A small sigh escaped her. You work too hard, Isabel. I'm only matching your pace. We can absorb a winter loss. You don't have to bleed yourself dry over it. It isn't about money, she said softly, leaning back into him. It's that it's ours. I want to protect it. His hand stilled. Ours. Not his. Not her father's. Gabriel turned her gently to face him, moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face, and this time he didn't ask permission before he kissed her, deep, claiming, entirely unlike the dry ceremony at the altar. Every cynical wall she'd built cracked and fell away onto the study rug. 2 days before Christmas, their sanctuary was breached. Isabel was in the greenhouse when a breathless footman found her. "Your Grace, a carriage from London." "Lady Constance." Isabel's stomach dropped. Lady Constance, Gabriel's aunt, possessed 3 estates, an infamous underbite, and a tongue that had ended reputations from Mayfair to Bath. "Where is the Duke?" "At the far sawmill, Your Grace." "Not back until dusk." Isabel squared her shoulders and walked into the drawing-room herself, still in her gardening dress. Lady Constance stood inspecting a priceless vase through a gold lorgnette, swathed in purple silk and mink. "So," she barked, "you're still here. Welcome to Rothmere, Lady Constance. Tea?" "I don't drink tea poured by the daughter of a common card cheat." She stalked closer, eyes raking over Isabel's plain dress. "Look at you. Gabriel paid £68,000 to bail your wretched father out of the gutter, and he didn't even get a woman who dresses the part." Old shame flared in Isabel's chest, but she was no longer the frightened girl who'd cowered in a London townhouse. "My father's debts are his own, Lady Constance, and my wardrobe is entirely my husband's concern. Now if you'll excuse me, I have an estate to run." "You run nothing," Constance snapped, face mottling red. "You're a purchased broodmare. Once you give him a son, he'll banish you to the dower house and keep a mistress in town, like every sensible man of his station." "Is that so?" The voice from the doorway was quiet and lethal. Gabriel stood there, riding leathers still dripping melted snow, eyes locked onto Isabel, scanning for damage before turning, ice-cold, on his aunt. "You will apologize to my wife." "Arthur, Gabriel, don't be absurd, I'm your aunt, she is the Duchess of Rothmere," he said, closing the distance. "She is the mistress of this house, and she is my wife. You will speak to her with respect or you will be back in your carriage before the horses are unhitched." He crossed to Isabel and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, presenting an unbroken front. "She is not a transaction, aunt. She is my partner, and she is worth 10 of you. Apologize." Constance's cruelty drained into humiliated silence. "I misspoke. I apologize." "Pack your bags," Gabriel said flatly. "You're leaving." He didn't wait for a response, leading Isabel from the room, down the corridor, into his study, the latch dropping shut behind them. He tossed his wet coat aside, jaw clenched tight. "She was wrong," he said roughly, crossing to cup her face in his hands. "I didn't buy property. I found a woman who knows the exact price of salted beef and refuses to back down to anyone. I found a woman who took this cold stone box and made it breathe. I found you, Isabel." A single tear slid over his thumb. The first she'd shed since learning her father was ruined, and not one born of sorrow, but of the last piece of ice around her heart finally giving way. "I will never let you go," he whispered. "You are mine, Isabel, and I am yours. Fully. Irrevocably." "Then let her leave," Isabel said, a small real smile breaking through. "We have ledgers to balance." He laughed, low and genuine, and pulled her into his arms. Spring arrived in Cornwall not gently but violently. Frozen ground cracking into a thick, sucking mud, driving rain rattling the leaded glass for weeks on end. Isabel loved every brutal, honest moment of it. In London, spring meant ballrooms and forced smiles. Here it meant lambing season, the frantic race to sow barley before the fields flooded, the raw labor of keeping 300 tenants alive. She was no longer the frightened bride clutching a brandy glass in the dark. She wore heavy wool hemmed above the mud, commanded the household with quiet, unyielding authority, and the ledgers had become her weapon rather than her cage. One grey Tuesday, Gabriel stumbled into the estate office soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, having spent since 3 that morning helping a veterinary surgeon pull a breached foal from a prized mare. Hot water, towels, and whiskey, Isabel called to Nora, already unbuttoning his sodden coat, unbothered by the mud and blood on his hands. The mare lived, he rasped. The foal didn't. I'm sorry, Gabriel. She took his cold hands in hers. You're shivering. I'm covered in filth. I'll ruin your dress. It's only wool. It washes. This was their romance, built not on sonnets, but on hot water and whiskey after a brutal night, on the certainty that when one faltered, the other stood firm. As she wiped the mud from his hands, the front bell chimed through the manor. Footsteps hurried across the foyer, a familiar voice rising above the butler's murmur. Isabel froze. She knew that voice, 23 years of rationalized debts and smooth, practiced lies. It's my father, she whispered, color draining from her face. Lord Edmund Hartley hadn't written a single letter since handing her into Gabriel's carriage. His presence here, in the Cornish mud, could only mean one thing. The money was gone. Stay here, Gabriel said, already moving toward the door. No, Isabel said, grabbing his arm. She looked at the ledgers on her desk, felt the gold band on her hand. This is my house. He is my ghost. I will see him. Gabriel studied her, saw the terror and the iron beneath it, and nodded once. I'll be right behind you. Lord Hartley stood in the drawing-room in London finery gone shabby at the edges, hands trembling on his walking stick, dripping mud onto the Persian rug. Isabel, my dear girl, you look well, he said, arms opening for an embrace she did not return. Why are you here, father? She asked flatly. Is that any way to greet your own blood? I travelled 3 days through this wretched storm to see my only child. You travelled 3 days because you're running from something, Isabel said, putting the width of the room between them. Or running toward Gabriel's vault. Which is it? Speak plainly, your boots are ruining the rug. His composure cracked. I need £20,000. The sum hung in the air, obscene. No, Isabel said. You ungrateful wretch, I gave you this life. Without me you'd be rotting in a debtor's cell. You owe me. I owe you nothing, she said, voice cutting through the room. You didn't secure a marriage. You arranged a liquidation. You sold me, took the money, and vanished. The transaction is complete, Lord Hartley. There is no further credit here. He pivoted toward Gabriel, still leaning silent in the doorway. Your Grace, surely, 20,000 is nothing to a man of your wealth. If I default, the scandal reaches your door. My wife's name is Ashworth, Gabriel said evenly. Her reputation is entirely secure. Be reasonable, the men I owe are not gentlemen, they'll come for me. Then I suggest you run, Gabriel replied, pushing off the doorframe, closing the distance with quiet menace. I do not manage this estate's charity, Lord Hartley. I suggest you appeal to its mistress, though I believe she's already answered you. He looked to Isabel, handing her the final word entirely. Isabel studied the broken man before her and felt nothing but exhaustion. There is a cottage on the northern edge of the Welsh property, she said, calm and cold. 2 rooms, a peat fire, a garden. My steward will provide food, clothing, and 5 shillings a week. You will never set foot in London again, never touch a card again. Leave the county, and the allowance stops. 5 shillings, I am a lord of the realm, I'm offering you a roof and a pulse. Take it, or walk out that door and face your creditors. But show your face at Rothmere again, and I'll have you removed for trespassing. His stick clattered to the floor. I'll take the coach to Wales, he whispered. You'll take the mail coach, she corrected. My footman will see you to the station. Goodbye, father. She turned her back before the doors even closed behind him. The adrenaline drained from her all at once. Her hands began to shake, gripping the velvet curtains hard enough to tear them. A warm weight settled over her shoulders. Gabriel, wordless, wrapping his arms around her from behind, face buried in her neck. He's gone, he murmured. Whitfield has strict orders, the man is dead to this household. I was so afraid, Isabel whispered, voice breaking. I know. I was afraid I'd hand him the vault keys just to make him stop looking at me that way. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Gabriel said. You built a fortress in the mud today. He can never touch you again. She turned in his arms, reached up, and pulled his mouth to hers, desperate, tasting of salt and survival, acclaiming with no ledger left standing between them. Months passed. The mud dried into the brilliant green of a Cornish summer. The estate thrived, the butcher's bills stayed fiercely contested, tenant roofs were mended, and the household ledgers balanced with ruthless precision. In late September, under a heavy gold harvest moon, Isabel sat brushing out her hair at the vanity, one hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach. Gabriel had said nothing dramatic when the physician confirmed it, only pressed his forehead to hers in silent, overwhelming relief. It was not a dynastic obligation. It was an extension of everything they had built. The door opened. Gabriel stepped in, shirt open at the collar, carrying 2 crystal glasses of brandy just as he had on their wedding night, yet entirely different now. You can't drink it, he said, a smile tugging at his mouth as he set one down before her. I poured it for the ceremony of it, Isabel smiled, inhaling the scent without dread, only gratitude. He stood behind her, hands settling on her shoulders, thumbs tracing her collarbone in the mirror, a deliberate, tender echo of that very first night. I reviewed the winter cottage projections today, he murmured. You approved a 5% increase without consulting me. They'll need it. The frost will be hard this year. I'm not arguing the decision, Duchess. Only noting you spend my money with alarming ease. It's our money, she corrected, pressing a kiss to his jaw. His hand slid down to rest over her stomach, fiercely protective, entirely present. Isabel, he said quietly. Yes? He brushed his thumb across her lip, a slow smile breaking across his face. May I stay? She covered his hand with hers, pressed it to her cheek, and answered without hesitation. Always. From a £68,000 debt to a fortress built on absolute trust, Isabel and Gabriel proved that real romance isn't a fairy tale, it's respect, shared burdens, and someone who hands you the sword when your demons come knocking.